Okay, thank you very much for your results. So this paper is going to be a theoretical paper, so we're not going in economic models or statistical analysis. It comes after a paper and another paper, and I'll explain the context of this paper. So it's proposing indicators to measure the risk of speculation. So our plan, we are going to do introduction, methodology, literature review, analysis, and results conclusions. So introducing this concept of speculation, it's still a challenging concept with a lot of ambiguity in the context of redundancy of crisis. We've got some elements in the definition of Caldor, which is the benchmark in this field, that are more or less obsolete, like the storage price, and some are useless for a regulator. When Caldor says in his definition, buying or selling in order to, no one knows what's in the mind of the trader. Some reduce speculation to a holding period, for instance, the indicator of Lucia 2007. So they say speculation is the contract that is closed at the end of the day. And we have not found any multidimensional approach, complete multidimensional approach for this concept of speculation. So it's still a challenging concept, like Lucia said, it would be empirically proven that in essence the distinction between a hedging position and a speculative position is the retention period between retention period of the security. In the past, many studies have tried to measure speculation by looking at it mainly from a narrow angle in order to simplify the process. Many were based on a comparison of two variables, namely the daily trading volume or transactions compared to the transactions still open at the end of the day, open interest, those that are not settled. Our whole initiative is to approach speculation in its complexity and multidimensional aspects in order to overcome restrictions associated to this two-dimensional measure, of course. So methodology, the whole methodology of our work was hypothetical deductive, but this is as a whole, it's overall, not only for this paper. So the central question here, how can we measure our 24 factors of speculation? Can each factor be measured with the same precision? Can all factors be measured by one accurate ratio? And does their significance lie in absolute or only in comparison? Our analysis is that first we've done a large-scale documentary and then empirical analysis to go to the conclusion that there are 24 significant factors of speculation in many categories. These factors were sound because they are driven from documentary analysis and empirical study submitted to almost 3,500 people with more than 100 answers from various fields related to financial markets, like academic and practitioners. Some previous attempts to measure speculation, so we've got Garcia et al. That suggests that the confrontation of the two variables give an idea on the importance of speculation, including the level of speculation. So volume divided by open interest contract. So it's quite the same as Pardo and Lucia. So, but Pardo and Lucia measure the variation of open interest on volume. One of the main assumptions underlying the use of these ratios is that speculators close out their position before the end of the day, which implies reducing speculator to a day trader. And that's the main issue we've got with this ratio. However, our analysis has shown that the extent of the concept is much more complex. Working in 1960 measures what he calls speculation index by the ratio between speculative future purchase contracts divided by hedging future sales contract. This ratio is so simple that it can be replicated in almost all financial markets, so this is good for data, but it assumes that speculative contracts are quantifiable, and this is the problem. So there needs to be a complement in order to strengthen the relevant aspect of our suggested ratios that we're going to suggest. So these 24 factors, what are they? We give the theoretical basis of these factors. So there are two categories, endogenous and exogenous. And in endogenous factors, we've got two categories also. So Factors linked to behavior, so marginalized ethics and environment conducing to fraud. We find this with Kindleberger, Artis, Hart, Newberry. Greed, race for prestige between traders, we find this with Kindleberger and Kaldor. Excessive risk-taking, we find this with Salon, Tirol. Previous intention to speculate in the short term, we find this with Kerners and Manner, Friedman. And then we've got factors of speculation linked to transactions. So we can't speculate with any transaction. There needs to be some transactions that are more favorable to speculation. So insurance, we find this with Artis and Leon, short selling, future sales, we find this with Kortner, spoofing, increasing complexity of derivatives, we find this with Leon, and weight of derivatives in the market. And then we've got the exogenous factors. We've got three categories in the exogenous factors of speculation. So regulatory framework, the possibility of regulatory and tax arbitrage, domination of parallel transactions and accounting, excessive deregulation and openness, with authorities having control less qualified than speculators, weight and power of financial lobbies and their protection, continuous quotation and frequency of transactions. Then we've got factors linked to financial context, so the domination of behavioral analysis, we find this with Orléans, oligopolistic structure, conflicts of interest, financial attractiveness, the profitability of financial activities exceeds that of real economic activities, volatility, this is a factor and the consequence of speculation. The link between this factor and speculation is the most complex impact among the 24 factors. Information asymmetry, opacity, and false rumors, we find this with Grossman, Stiglitz, Tirol. And the exogenous factors, we've got macroeconomic debt framework, so the banking system with deterioration of solvency. We find this with Kindleberger. Monetary creation and abundance of liquidity. Leverage is also a factor of speculation. We found this with Kessler. And securitization and negotiability of the debt. These are the 24 factors. Now, the second category is we show the practical proofs of these theoretical theories, but we won't expand a lot in this. But we give, factors we found in second-hand literature related to practices that show how these factors are sound in terms of their relation to speculation. Right. And in fact, we will see that with these elements from practical, we brought our ratios. For instance, if we see the domination of parallel transactions in accounting, we see that shadow banking counts a lot. So if we can measure shadow banking in a country, we can get a ratio that gives us information about over-the-counter activity and parallel transactions. Same thing with the, for instance, oligopolistic structure and conflicts of interest. If we are in a country where we've got, these institutions that are too big to fail, if we can measure the market share of the 5 first banking institutions or financial market institutions, if it's too high, this gives us feedback about this factor, which is oligopolistic structure. So once we get all these results and we compile them in a tool that will be the topic of the next paper, we can get our ratios. These ratios are a suggestion of the researcher, so they are not as sound as the factors. As I said, the factors are supported by theoretical, documentary, second-hand, and empirical studies. The ratios are only supported by theoretical and documentary studies. So there may be a new research on the empirical field to support the validity of these ratios. So our suggestion comes for the first factor, the only one we did not get a ratio for, which is greed. So this goes back to behavioral finance, and this is not our specialization. So behavioral finance may give us more clues to measure how we can measure the greed and the war of prestige between traders in a specific market. Okay. For the second factor, which is excessive risk-taking, so we've got 3 suggestive ratios. The first one is liabilities excluding equity divided by the total balance sheet. The doubtful receivables divided by the total balance sheet. So like we saw in the crisis of Argentina, the amount of doubtful receivables was at its peak just before the crisis. And we see this with Clio 1991. Financial market operations divided by the total balance sheet. So if we've got an institution that's specialized in lending, this is B2C. If we get financial operations taking more and more size in the balance sheet, so this means it's not doing its primary mission, it's going to financial markets because of fast profits. So this gives us clues about their financial implication. No, not only for banks, but generally now banks, and especially investment banks, are the most active on financial markets. Marginalized ethics and environment favoring fraud. So we've got, like, we can measure investments that exclude socially responsible investment divided by the GDP, or we can measure the value of fraud divided by GDP. The problem is that with this second ratio, which is the value of fraud, fraud is intended not to be measured, of course. So saying that we'll take a ratio based on the value of fraud is like saying, okay, it's like saying we are gonna analyze something that its primary goal was to be hidden. So this is difficult, but still it can give, there are some organizations and some NGOs that try to measure fraud, and also fiscal authorities try to measure NGO. We've got an issue, which is we can have two countries, for instance, with the GDP of maybe 100 billion, okay? In the second countries, we have financial authorities that are twice as powerful as in the first country. If they have the same amount of fraud, the second country will reveal more fraud. Why? Because the financial controllers are more powerful. So we need to introduce another relativization about this ratio, which is linked to the strengths and the budgets of financial authorities or prudential authorities. The fourth ratio is the intention to speculate in the short term. This one is difficult to measure. So we gave a suggestion of the value of undelivered futures divided by the total value of futures. Generally, this is 98%, 97%. So these are the most, in the 5 categories of ratios, this is the most difficult to measure because it's linked to the behavior of the financial operator. And it's really, really difficult to measure. Now we go to the transactions, which are more straightforward. So the futures can be measured very easily, the total value of the futures divided by GDP. Insurances, so we can measure, for instance, the weight of insurance derivatives like CDS divided by GDP. We can measure financial market operations of insurances divided by their total balance sheet. So the more financial market operations are present in the balance sheet, the more it's linked to introducing insurances in financial markets. Short selling, we should know that some countries forbid short selling, okay, just as straightforward as it is, and some allow it. So we can measure the size of short selling divided by the total volume of the stock exchange measured. Weight of derivatives, also this is quite easily measured, divided by GDP. Increasing complexity and excessive financial innovation, this one is difficult. This one is a difficult ratio because how can we measure the complexity of the products present in certain financial markets? The more products are complex, the more they are difficult to understand, and so the more they are keen to help speculators. And so we suggested the R&D budget, but we are still looking for solutions for measuring this ratio, and we are still wondering if there is a more accurate way to measure this ratio. Spoofing. Spoofing is canceling the transaction just before it happens. So it's sending an order and canceling it before just it takes place. So it's easily measured, the number of orders cancelled divided by the number of orders. So we are done with the ratios regarding endogenous factors, behaviors, and transactions. Let's go on to the factors linked to exogenous factors. So first one is tax and regulatory arbitrage are possible. So we can measure shadow banking divided by GDP and the volume of total tax evasion divided by GDP. So again, tax evasion is intended not to be seen. So measuring it is quite a challenge. Domination of parallel accounting and operations. So we've got off-balance sheet of listed financial institutions divided by total balance sheet, and over-the-counter transactions divided by total transactions. Continuous quote and frequency of transactions. So the number of orders executed per day divided by the total market capitalization. And then we've got deregulation and excessive openness, with authorities having less qualified staff than financial operators. So we've got 5 ratios to measure. This one is the more rich in terms of ratios. So the first ratio suggested is the market capitalization divided by budget of regulatory authorities. So if we have a huge market with the low budget authorities, this is not going to make it, of course. So it leaves a lot of room to speculators. Market capitalization divided by regulatory staff, for instance, total budget. Average trader salary divided by average regulator salary. This is quite a nice ratio to explore, but it shows what's the qualification of the controller and what's the qualification of the speculator, or the the one that is keen to be speculator. Incoming foreign investments divided by GDP. The more we have foreign investments, the less we can control our markets. And then stock market assets held by foreigners divided by market capitalization. These last two show the openness of the market. And then we've got the weight and power of financial lobbies. This is quite difficult, but now we've got a lot more and more NGOs working on this. They measure the expenditure of financial lobbying divided by GDP. So we know that here in Brussels, it's the second center of lobbying in the world. And then we've got financial factors. So oligopolistic markets and conflict of interest, capitalization of the 5 financial leaders divided by market capitalization of all of them, turnover of the top 3 rating agencies divided by their turnover, domination of behavioral analysis over fundamental analysis. This one is quite complex. Difficult to know if most people in financial market, they use fundamental analysis or chartist and technical analysis, but we suggested like the budgets of the technical analyst societies, because they exist, and the salaries of technical analysts compared with financial analysts. Volatility, quite straightforward. We measure the variance in a market. Information asymmetry, opacity, and false rumors. We can measure the value of insider trading. So again, this is linked to fraud. Financial attractivity. So financial activities are more profitable than real economic activity. We can measure the average salary of a trader divided by average salary in a country, or the absolute value of the variation of the stock markets compared to the variation of the GDP. And the last category is macroeconomic factors. So we can measure debt on GDP. This one shows the indebtedness. Outstanding loans from financial institutions divided by equity. To measure the monetary creation and abundance of liquidity, we can measure the M3 monetary divided by GDP, or the variation of M3. And then securitization, we can measure securitized debts on GDP. And the leverage can be measured quite easily, also with current liabilities divided by shareholders' equity. And these are the ratios suggested for the 24 factors. So some limits is that it's necessary to set up accurate thresholds, because we can't say starting from this threshold it's speculation and below it's not. This needs to be used in a comparative perspective. So measuring one country does not give any information. We have to measure, for instance, France in comparison to Belgium, in comparison to the United States. So this is useful in a comparative perspective. And we need alpha empirical support for both ratios and their weighting, similar to that of the factor ranking. And the conclusion is that most factors can be measured one by one, many straightforward, some complicated. Factors linked to behavior are the most challenging and should refer to behavioral finance. A comparative use is the aim of these ratios, either chronological or geographical. Further, empirical studies could be held to confirm accuracy and provide appropriate weighting for each ratio. Correlations can help in overcoming the lack of some ratios and will eventually show that the number of factors could be reduced to almost 5. This is the topic of the next paper, which will show that we can go from 24 to 22 and then 17 and then 15 factors. And so we can overcome some factors whose ratio are complicated. So for instance, the first one is really correlated with another one, which we have a really straightforward ratio. So we double the weight and we just take the measure of the second ratio. And this is quite helpful in this. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I just have a couple of comments. Thank you for your presentation. It's quite comprehensive analysis of the problem. Okay, so I'm going to discuss the paper. Well, some comments. So it's a very interesting effort to study this kind of ambiguous concept of speculation, because between hedging and speculation, sometimes it's kind of blurry, the differences. It's a nice framework to think the potential factors of speculation. So this thing of dividing between endogenous to the market, exogenous, and these different categories is a very simple and clear framework to understand how different all these factors are and how they impact. It's a very comprehensive list of factors. And weight, this is something I guess it's part of it's coming, how you construct this. Is basically what you were saying at the end. Things that it got me thinking. So theoretical background, I kind of missed. I was thinking that maybe if we consider a model, a theoretical model could tell us how these different factors influence or what are the most important. So we might shed light on the different mechanisms and data analysis. So I would like to motivate the use of these factors by actually, basically by probably just showing simple correlations about when we observe speculation or cases of speculation and how is that compared with those factors. And whether these are is a cause or consequence. So I would like some sort of quantitative or econometric analysis to be able to see which factors are the ones that matter the most. I think that there could be a lot that could be done in this area. Those are basically my comments. Yeah. So there was a couple of factors that you could say, okay, these if we measure, I don't remember the whole list from the top of my head, but let's say the government debt divided by GDP, you may think, oh, that's a factor that influence, that makes speculation more attractive, right? But others might be the amount of, you said like steal, I forgot the word, the fraud. That's like a consequence of speculation. I'm just saying, like, the one is like a cause, the other one is like a consequence. And I think we should be careful in distinguishing those two. Those are my comments. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you, Carlos. So I don't know if you have
Any questions?
I may make some questions of myself. So I think it's a difficult issue to handle, as you recognize. I think for me, as a general comment, I think some of your indicators can be related to fundamentals or to speculation. So you cannot say that some of your indicators are clear in terms of speculations. For example, future. Future can be used for hedging or for speculation. So how can you say we use only the amount of futures in the market. What exactly are they doing? Are they protecting their business or no? Or are they speculating against some stocks? But one suggestion that I would make is to create a global factor, but I already see like a summary, like some factor analysis. You can do a factor analysis of that to create a single factor and try to correlate it with the other measures of speculation that usually you found in the literature, you validate or not, and to show the advantage of your indicator. So that is basically my comments. But I think you have a lot of work. If you want to apply this empirically, it will not be easy because you are being really ambitious, trying to cover all the areas of speculation.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going to answer these remarks a little bit. So, regarding the... I don't know if the paper is still here.
I think I closed.
Oh, it's okay. It's okay.
You can open it in the Explorer. Open the Explorer. Yes, it is there.
Yeah, there we go. Right.
Oh, it's still there maybe in the already.
Okay, so let's go back to the whole tool so that we save some time.
We are still on time, 4 minutes. It's correct 4 minutes.
4 minutes, right.
But if you need more,
right, so I'm going back to this tool. So by the way, here the blue value is the weight of the factor on speculation. So I did not mention this. And this is the weight of the ratio. So in fact, this is empirically sound, but this is not verified for the moment. So
how did you produce the weights?
From the empirical study, we did 3,500 and that we got 100 answers. The factors were ranked from a scale from 1 to 5. Okay, so we got the averages given by these experts to the factor. And so we saw that all the factors were more than 3 to 5, except one. It was 2.9, so we said it was significant 3. So all the factors were significant factors of speculation according to experts. Right. According to regarding the weights, yeah, of course it's a limit as it's another research, of course. So we can do the same work as this, but it's another empirical study, of course. So this one took 2 years. So maybe this one will also take a lot of time, but it's still something necessary. Regarding the econometric, it was a huge question in the beginning because I spoke with some econometric specialists, and they say, you need a variable that is explaining and the variable that is explained. The problem is that the measure of the variable that is explained, which is speculation, we don't have it. So it's really difficult to make this econometric work because we don't have data on one side. We don't know what is the ratio of speculation. So this is an attempt to build this indicator, because all of this you're going to do a weight average, and you're going to go with one index, and then you can compare it to the ratios present in literature. As for the cause or the consequence, yeah, some of these ones may seem a consequence, like volatility. I completely agree with you, and some of the others may seem like a consequence. But we try to find the justification from literature that all these are a cause, and also from the empirical study. Thank you also. So Carlos, thank you very much for taking time for this. And Sergio, well, for the futures, it's a very good point. Actually, when they were created in the 80s, it's like 97% of the futures were used for hedging. And 30 years after, we have 98% used for speculation, which means 98% of futures are not delivered. So, of course, we can say, okay, I bought a future, but I do not want to be delivered because I closed my company. But this is extremely marginal. Okay, most of futures are not delivered because they are settled. So trader, closed position with the reverse position of the other trader. They close position and they give the difference. The winner gets the difference of the amount in comparison to the spot price. So yeah, futures, actually we measure them here. Where are the value futures contract? Because we saw in the literature that most of the futures nowadays are used for speculation. They are really good because you can win a lot with the future, more than if you buy the actual products. For instance, oil with a derivative like a call option or a future, you can make a lot more money. And also the margin is lower for the futures. And then we can take, of course, this is intended because these weights averages are intended to make a global factor. And then we can, of course, compare. This is a really good idea. But I really welcome your suggestions after if you have a more accurate ratio, because again, this was an invitation to ratios more than something that is empirically sound. So it's still, like I said, it's under construction. Right, so I think that's all. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Mario.
Let's proceed.